Well, good morning. We have an interesting way to begin this morning because I pose the question from our speaker, what is the status of Abraham Lincoln today? He is such an iconic figure as America's greatest president that this question may seem odd, but he has often been reinterpreted through the prism or looking glass of modern times, and according to our speaker and others, now is one of those times. Well, certainly our Historical Institute is the place to discuss this, and yet our speaker could be considered very brave in noting what he calls, quote, the fading image of Abraham Lincoln, unquote. For if he spoke to the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia at their site of Fort McNair in Washington, he might be reminded that the last people on that site who were critical of Lincoln were the conspirators who were hung there. And our speaker brings a new perspective on Lincoln to us as the Professor Emeritus of Sociology from the University of Georgia, the former Senior Fellow of the Smithsonian Institution, and currently my colleague on the Advisory Committee of the United States Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He is the author of the award-winning Abraham Lincoln and the Forge of National Memory, and is about to complete his next book, Abraham Lincoln in the Post-Heroic Era, History and Memory in the Late 20th Century. His talk today is entitled Transfiguration, Abraham Lincoln and the Civil Rights Movement. In this, he will discuss two themes. One, the difference between the way historians and artists portray Lincoln and what ordinary Americans believe about him. And two, the dramatic impact of the civil rights movement on professional and public understanding of Lincoln's accomplishments. I have the great honor to present, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Barry Schwartz.
Why, I would like to thank the Abraham Lincoln Institute for inviting me to come to meet with you and to speak with you. This is the first time I've been here, and it's a great honor. Let me express my gratitude by getting directly into my discussion so as not to take time away from other speakers. Let me just put up this illustration, and then I'll begin my talk. Well, historians are trained to see the world through the eyes of men and women living in earlier times, and without moral judgment, to conceive events from their standpoint. Consider in this connection a time traveler finishing several days of fun commemorating the Lincoln Memorial's 1922 dedication. The air is full of good feeling, and never has the reconciliation of the states been affirmed so dramatically. President Harding emphatically declares union to have been Lincoln's world goal. Federal and Confederate veterans line the memorial steps. Newspapers and their advertisers declare joyfully, comrades in arms from the North and the South now join hands. All hearts acknowledge the great reconciliation. Suddenly, a traveler finds himself in the late 20th century, and he's utterly confused by what he sees. A Star Trek episode appearing on a device showing talking and moving pictures in the home depicts Lincoln's spirit boarding a spacecraft, greeting its, quote, charming negress, unquote, cordially, commenting on the status of blacks during his lifetime, and apologizing to her for the foolishness of my century. To this apology, sudden tragedy adds a new layer of meaning. Abraham, Martin, and John, a popular song, appears under a sheet music cover picturing four men on Mount Rushmore. Abraham Lincoln's face remains on the mountain, but John Kennedy's replaced George Washington, while Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King appear in the place of Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt. Our visitor can make no sense of this. He scratches his head as Governor Mario Cuomo claims that Lincoln's work is not done yet. Many Americans still suffer under a ruthless economic system, still feel racial, religious, ethnic, and gender discrimination, unquote. Ruthless economic system, racial, religious, ethnic, gender discrimination. When, in the heat of war, did Lincoln have time to worry about these things? Reared in a world of Jim Crow, our traveler is struck most by the frequency with which Lincoln appears in the company of African Americans. He's pictured with Martin Luther King here in an advertisement. He's pictured between Rosa Parks on your right and the group pointing to Lincoln's assassin in Memphis on your left. And he wears a black armband to commemorate or mark the death of civil rights leader Roy Wilkins. From his own time, the visitor cannot remember anyone saying that Lincoln dreamed of a poverty-free or multiracial society. But in the late 20th century, he's shocked to find artists and historians claiming just that. Well, let me get rid of this. Well, do ordinary Americans think about Lincoln the way artists and scholars do? Our 1922 friend consults Merle Peterson's Abraham Lincoln in American Memory, which is by far the most comprehensive and authoritative chronicle of Lincoln representations. But he gets less information from Peterson than he hoped. From a 138-year series of Lincoln biographies, monuments, icons, shrines, ritual observances, Peterson discerns 5 images, and that is the savior of the Union, the great emancipator, man of the people, first American, and self-made man. Lincoln in American memory, as Peterson conceives it, means Lincoln represented by text and symbol, not Lincoln in the mind of ordinary Americans. To clear up the visitor's confusion, I would like to report to you on 4 national surveys concerning what Americans think about Lincoln. And in the first survey, which was conducted in 1999, interviewers asked a series of questions, including, why do you think Lincoln was one of the 3 greatest presidents? And a second survey was conducted in 2001, and this survey asked a different question. Suppose a nephew or a niece about 12 years old had just heard mention of Lincoln and asked you to explain what Lincoln had done. What would you say? And this question seems especially appropriate for investigating Lincoln in American memory, since it focuses on what adults recall as most important to communicate to a younger generation. Well, I assumed that Peterson's first type, the savior of the Union, would be mentioned most often. After all, secession denies union, and without union there can be no emancipation. Yet, Table 1 in your handout shows that 7 and 14% of the 2 national samples mention Lincoln as savior of the Union. The single most frequent explanation of Lincoln's greatness, and that is 46% in the Maryland survey and 66% in the Knowledge Network survey, show that most people deem Lincoln's greatness to reside in emancipation. Also, many people gave responses that went beyond emancipation, and these called for a separate category, which we labeled equal rights. And these respondents, 11 and 9% in the two samples, described Lincoln as prophet of the contemporary ideals of racial equality, even though the evidence for such a belief on Lincoln's part is lacking. If both emancipation and civil rights responses are considered together, then fully 58 and 75% of the two groups of respondents gave one or both of those reasons for Lincoln's greatness. So, what we're seeing is that Lincoln is associated with African Americans not only on song covers, not only in paintings, and not only in prints, not only in cartoons, but also in the mind of the people. Okay. I would like now to present briefly a second set of findings. Since the Maryland and the Knowledge Network surveys were administered at a time today when civil rights concerns were foremost in the public mind, we want to know whether different results would obtain from surveys administered at a time when nobody gave a damn about civil rights. Respondents from Gallup survey of January 1945, during the World War II, and a national employee survey taken in 2001 provide us with a means of comparison. And what we did, we simply removed the unemployed members of the Gallup survey to make the two comparable. So what we're doing now is comparing Lincoln in a segregated society of 1945 to Lincoln in an integrated society of 2001, and we want to know what people think about him. And the Gallup question, don't ask me why this question was asked, but the Gallup question was, who do you think was the greater man, Washington or Lincoln, and why? Well, in the present 2001 survey, here's the result in brief. 31% attributed Lincoln's superiority to Washington to his being the great emancipator. Another 6% attributed his superiority to his views on civil rights. Only 5% deemed Lincoln greater than Washington because he was the savior of the Union. So, based on a third sample of contemporary Americans, although using different questions about Lincoln, we find further evidence of the great emancipator's current cultural power. Now, here's the critical finding. In the 1945 Gallup survey, what they did was to code Union and emancipation responses into a single category, possibly because the coders took for granted the practical connection between Union and emancipation, which we can't do today. It's much more difficult for us to do this. Why in the 21st century? And so what we assumed was this. Now, let's just assume that every single response in 1945 was an emancipator response. That is, every one question said that Lincoln was greater than Washington because he was the great emancipator. In fact, most of the responses were probably Union responses. But even if we do that, we find far more people who attribute Lincoln's greatness to emancipation rather than saving the Union. The details are on your handout, and I'll not bother going into them. So, as we move backward in time, like this time traveler, as we move backward in time from our environment, which is highly sensitive to civil rights, to 1945 environment, which was not, fewer people see Lincoln's greatness residing in his emancipation policy more see Lincoln's greatness residing in his saving of the Union. This tendency is also evident in the work of professional historians. And I view this tendency, that is to say, civil rights issues shaping the historian's conception of Lincoln, to be very problematic and consequential. And I would now like to shift gears and talk to you very briefly about Lincoln as he appears in history texts, high school history texts, from 1920 to present. And I'm going to break these texts down into two parts, those which were written before 1965 and those which were written after 1965. Well, during the 1920s and the 1930s, leading historians believed that the Civil War resulted from extremist agitation in the North and the South, that emancipation failed to affect the lives of the black masses, that the war's horrendous cost could never be justified. 20th century historians are more inclined to consider the war to be inevitable, to have been inevitable, morally just. They sympathize with abolitionists and radical Republicans, judge emancipation and Reconstruction more important than North-South reconciliation, and include extremists, John Brown, William Lloyd Garrison, Thaddeus Stevens, among the war heroes. The savior of the Union and the man of the people resonate with David Blight's reconciliationist memory of the Civil War, which assumes that decent men from the North and the South fought gallantly for what they believed in and should respect each other's heritage. However, the new Lincoln, the great emancipator, resonates with Blight's emancipationist memory, which defines the war's essence as a struggle for racial justice. We are now in the midst of the first great surge of emancipationist memory, and the 40 textbooks that I mentioned to you will bear this out. Before 1965, textbook authors described slavery as a moral wrong, but defined emancipation as an instrument of Union victory, something that was good but never an end in itself. Representations of slavery are sparse. Slavery is represented as a philosophical rather than a humanitarian evil, not so much a source of concrete suffering as a violation of the abstract principles of free labor, sanctity of private property, and individual liberty. After 1965, we get a different picture. In these texts, why commitment to social reform is expressed in reformist portrayals of Lincoln and the Civil War. Throughout the 60s and the 70s especially, this theme appears, as it does through the 80s and 90s. Slavery themes are multiplied. The emancipation theme becomes more prominent than ever. The northern population, according to one text by Bragdon, McCutcheon, and Ritchie, the northern population could never justify the war's carnage by mere restoration of the Union. Why the Emancipation Proclamation aroused a renewed spirit in the North and strengthened the will to win the war. Lincoln at Gettysburg, according to Boyer, Todd, and Curdy, announced to the world that the abolition of slavery had become the major purpose of the Civil War. The death of so many men could have meaning only if the country remained dedicated to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. This unfinished work was not the saving of the Union, but the movement to free the slaves and an enduring commitment to racial justice, unquote. See your summary in Table 3 of your handout. Now I'm going to conclude my comments by saying that the Civil War makes sense today as a struggle for racial equality, and the great emancipator explicates the meaning of this new interpretation. He puts definite constructions on the events associated with it, gets the connotation of those events into the open where people can see it and grasp it in a collective as well as a personal way. Specifically, the disadvantage of contemporary African Americans seems more understandable as a product of slavery, while slavery seems less relevant apart from its legacy of affliction. As our environment's horizon of expectations becomes emancipationist as opposed to reconciliationist, it inspires and welcomes modifications of old structures, like the Lincoln Memorial Plaque that commemorates Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, which has adopted the premise that the Emancipation Proclamation redefined the Civil War, quote, changing it from a war for union to a war for human freedom, unquote, and has explicitly made Lincoln's significance for racial equality its major focus. The Department of Interior, responding to political and budgetary pressures, directs Civil War battle site superintendents to, quote, recognize and include in all public displays and educational multimedia presentations the unique role that slavery played in causing the war. Unique role? What does unique role mean? Slavery clearly was a necessary but not sufficient cause of the Civil War. Secession would have led to war with or without slavery. Secession was the necessary and sufficient cause of the Civil War. Nevertheless, the Interior Department's directive put the power of the state behind an emancipationist interpretation of the war. The fading of the Union savior and folk hero, like the rise of the great emancipator, is symptomatic of a compassion-centered, also known as victim-centered, framework of national memory. In a society whose past seems to be as much a moral burden as a source of inspiration, where the duty to remember applies more to atrocity than to heroic achievement, the savior of the Union is less relevant than the great emancipator. Also, there's no prominent place for the down-to-earth people's president sitting beside a cracker barrel, peeling an apple and telling jokes, or even the compassionate president brooding over casualty figures and visiting wounded soldiers. The beneficiaries of this kind of humanitarianism have always been white soldiers, including Confederates. Less relevant even than the kindly man of the people is the self-made man, the dynamo, who relies on his own will and wit to rise from the log cabin to the White House. The self-made man is no longer relevant, no longer logically connected as he once was to Lincoln's views on slavery. The slaveholder is now regarded as the epitome of evil alone, no longer the logical contradiction of free labor, self-reliance, perseverance, in short, the self-made man. That the civil rights movement affected Lincoln's scholarship had been well known, but hardly investigated, so that we had little idea of when this change began. We had little idea of how far our historians have exaggerated, underestimated, or ignored the different lineaments of Lincoln's life and presidency, or whether public beliefs lagged or led historiography. The present research shows that current portrayals of Lincoln contradict in several ways the Lincoln of the early 20th century. Not only do historians place greater emphasis on emancipation and slavery, they also write for a highly receptive audience that exaggerates their exaggerations. These same historians de-emphasize, and their readers seem almost to have forgotten the traditional Lincoln. Ida Tarbell's and Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, the common, self-reliant man of the people who raised himself by his own bootstraps. And so our time traveler friend can go home to 1922 a sadder but a wiser man. But the ultimate question, which he's already asked himself, remains: do today's professional and public beliefs reflect new facts, or do they reflect new ideological commitments and moral passions? Thank you.
I'd like two members of our board to help me with wireless mics. We would like to, when you ask your question, we want it to be on a mic. So while we're getting the mics in the hands of some our board members to get them around to you, I want to ask the first question, prerogative of the chair. I think we all have our own degree of philosophy about why things happened in Lincoln's life, and I confess I believe absolutely that slavery was the ultimate thing, but slavery was the thing that led to secession. But what Lincoln thought was so bad about secession was it was tearing apart the concept that individuals had made this compact with each other that they were going to be self-governing. And it was self-governing that is at the very heart of what Lincoln was a champion of. And I just wonder how that reflects itself in the...
Okay. Why, let me say first of all that, yes... oh, I'm sorry. Okay now? Yeah. Let me say first that there's no doubt that the war was about slavery, that it was slavery and issues concerning slavery and Southern aspirations or Southern fears about the future of slavery that led to secession. There's no question about that. One thing, however, is certain. Even the most radical historian would never argue that when I say radical, the historian, when the leftist, the left end of the spectrum, no radical historian would argue that Lincoln would have gone to war to free the slaves without secession. That no one has argued that, well, Lincoln comes into office and if the South had not seceded, Lincoln would have launched a war against the Southern states in order to abolish emancipation. No one has ever argued that point. And nor, as far as I know, has anyone ever argued the point that if the federal forces had won the war at once, if they had put down the rebellion immediately in the first 6 months of the first year, nobody suggests that Lincoln would have abolished slavery. Slavery clearly would have remained intact. Now, as far as the Union, in other words, the slaves were, emancipation came about because of the skill with which the South fought the war. They simply outfought the federal forces, and that's why that is one of the conditions. that contributed to emancipation. The matter of union is the one that interests me, Bob. I take not a rational view of this, that is, the union proves that, free men can govern themselves and so forth. But the union was sacred. It was not simply, the union in and of itself was sacred. It was something to cherish, something to embrace. I don't believe that those 75,000 volunteers who enthusiastically, joined up and went south into Virginia, I really don't think that they did that because they said to themselves, hey, what the rebellion is doing is challenging the concept of free government. I don't think they thought in such intellectual terms. My sense is that, yes, they enthusiastically went to war to preserve something sacred.
Hi, Barry. A new letter has surfaced in Chicago that was supposedly written in Lincoln's hand before the election of 1860, where he says that slavery has to be the platform of the Republican Party.
Slavery, that's one of the important things that, this is a very important question, not so much for the question itself, but for the perspective that it imposes upon us, that we tend to forget that we're dealing not with Lincoln today, but with the Republican Party. Lincoln was the leader of the Republican Party. He was the representative of the Republican Party. He was the candidate of the Republican Party. The Republican Party had two characteristics that distinguished it from its opponents. One, it was anti-slavery, passionately so, and racist as well, passionately so. The 1860 election in New York City involved a referendum on whether free blacks should be able to vote. Something like 30,000 individuals who supported Lincoln because of his anti-slavery platform 30,000 voted for him because of his anti-slavery. Something like, 300 supported the vote for free blacks. So to say that Lincoln was anti-slavery is to say that he represented a party that was also anti-slavery, and he represented that position passionately. But let's stop right there, and that is, we need to be careful before drawing any implications beyond that. To be anti-slavery did not mean that one wants free blacks to be able to vote. These were two entirely different things.
Okay, the man in the dark sweater. Could you get the microphone, please? Mic's right there. And let's take that one next.
There was one text for the southern states and one text for the northern states. Are the trend lines you're talking about in your surveys playing out the same way in the south and the north as far as you know?
I just last night gave a talk on Lincoln in the South. And just very briefly, I will say to you that there's only an 8 percentage point difference in the percentage of Southerners and non-Southerners who deem Lincoln the greatest president. When you rank presidents in the South, Lincoln ranks at the top. He ranks first. And when you ask Southerners why Lincoln was a great president, they give you the same reasons as non-Southerners do. He was the great emancipator and the prophet of civil rights.
Do you think that to some extent at least, Lincoln as the great emancipator was in second place because of the racial attitudes of the beholder, including the historians. To pick up on the last question, I remember myself in that great text, Morrison and Commager for high school students. The early editions started their comments on emancipation with the dismissive sentence, "As for Sambo." Now, with those attitudes, isn't it clear that the historians writing that way would write from their racial attitudes as much as from historiography?
The question that I posed at the very end of my presentation, that is to say, is the new Lincoln a product of new facts or new ideology or moral commitments? That was not a rhetorical question. That was not a rhetorical question. However, it was a question that betrays my skepticism about much that has recently been written about Lincoln. My skepticism includes the work of David Blight, Gary Wills, and others. I will not name the people I disagree with. I'd rather do the opposite.
Tan jacket.
I have a multi-part question. If Fort Sumter had not been fired upon, if the Southern states had not seceded, in view of historians, how would Lincoln have handled the problem of slavery? Would he have issued an Emancipation Proclamation? If so, how would he have enforced it? And if not, what would have happened to slavery eventually?
I'm not no, that's very fine. Don't forget the Emancipation Proclamation itself envisions slavery coming to an end in the 20th century, at the turn of the 20th century. And why this would happen gradually, you say. But in any event, I'm not a historian, and I leave it to my betters to give you a response to that question. Lincoln believed, probably wrongly, that it would die of its own accord, it would die of its own weight. He seemed to have confidence in that. That was a very comforting assumption, after all. That would simply keep slavery contained in the States, then it'll eventually disappear. Whether it would have disappeared, I don't know. I have the impression that it would, but I must leave it to others. I beg your pardon, sir? If what?
He would not have issued an Emancipation Proclamation.
Oh, you mean if there was no secession? No, how could he?
Pardon?
How could he? He would have violated the Constitution. How could he? In fact, he was not even sure that the Emancipation Proclamation would be held constitutional after the war ended, since it was a war measure.
We'll take two more, and then we'll take a break. Steve?
I find it interesting you criticize David Blight when David Blight makes it abundantly clear that the emancipation and justification for the war that he and Frederick Douglass promoted as the years went on became dimmer and dimmer until reconciliation took out any aspect of slavery being a cause of the war, took out any aspect of the African American fight for equality. So by 1913, with the 50-year anniversary at Gettysburg, there were no African American soldiers, and the only African Americans who were there were predominantly people serving in terms of that. Right. So I find it interesting that you criticize David for that, yet it seems very in line with what you're saying. Secondly, those of us who are researching Union soldiers find that in many ways the Union soldiers themselves were ahead of Lincoln in many of their attitudes about freedom and emancipation and what they were going to do after the war. And it's very striking what happened with members of the GAR and others who, for many years after the war, insisted on the legacy being that they fought for freedom, that they did not simply fight for union, along with what you're saying, an almost religious feeling about the union itself. But then, 1860 and 1864, when the sworn policy of the government was to destroy slavery, the Union soldiers saw that as a greater justification for enlistment and for continuing on the war and voting for Lincoln in 1864. I wonder if you comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, there are several facets to that question. I do not think that the Gettysburg festivities in 1913 were held with a view to overcoming or to dismissing why the emancipationist theory or perspective on the Civil War. I do not believe in the public mind that such a perspective was dominant. I believe that there were maybe there were a handful of there were certainly the abolitionists. The abolitionists held that view, but I do not believe that the general public between 1865 and 1913 was committed to the view that the Civil War was a war to free the slaves. I don't believe that. I do not think it's true. I don't think an emancipationist theory or an emancipationist perspective existed among the population at large during this period. Such a view of the Civil War took hold after World War II, not in the 19th century. Now, as far as the soldiers, I've read McPherson's work on this, and I don't know what to say about it from here. It's a work which he himself, he has a very long methodological introduction, and which deals with sampling issues and the problem of self-selected samples and so forth. I really don't want to get into that because I don't have anything here to I really can't respond to that particular issue. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just unable to do it.
I just wanted to direct my comments to the gentleman who spoke about Henry Steele Commager. I never thought that would come up. I was the research assistant to Henry Steele Commager in his later years, and I specifically asked him about that question about Sambo. Henry Steele Commager was one of the greatest liberals of all time, risking his life, actually, in battling Joseph McCarthy. And he said he regretted that, but in the context of the times when he wrote it, it was just like when you talked about Negroes, and today you don't use the word Negroes. And Sambo was a phrase you used then. He wrote these things a long time ago. He was a very, very old man when he died, but he was extremely liberal and